There is one speaker and one leader who, throughout certainly recent history, always garners a lot of attention. And every 4 to 8 years, we get to see a different version of this speaker and leader. And no, this isn't some kind of shape-shifting vampire, although some people maybe say it is. This, of course, is the President of the United States. When they start their term in office, they deliver an inauguration speech. And a lot of other countries in the world don't really have this ceremony where, yes, there's maybe a small acceptance speech that a winning elected official gives when they're confirmed, but they don't have this whole ceremony and transfer of power in the way that you see in the United States. In just over a year's time, we're going to potentially see this happen again with the 2024 US presidential election. In the year leading up to this election, where maybe we see a new president, maybe we don't, I'm going to look at some of the inauguration speeches through history where some of the most famous speeches and famous lines from speeches have come from, and dissect what these presidents are doing in these speeches, looking at the context in which they're speaking in and how that feeds into their message, looking at the development of the inauguration speeches throughout years. And at the end of these analyses, I'm also going to offer possible suggestions about how they could have made the speeches better. Now, of course, I'm not standing here as a president of the USA. I don't have any idea what the office and the responsibility of that entails. So this is very much just for informational purposes only. But I think there's a lot that we can learn from these speeches, a lot from the development of these speeches, and thinking about what we can take into our own speeches, and also thinking about how our speeches might look different to an inauguration speech. You should be not standing up on stage trying to sound like the President of the United States on the day of their election. You are going to have different contexts, different purposes behind your speech. During these analyses, I'm using the video footage of these speeches. So just a quick disclaimer, I do not claim any rights to this footage at all. All of the rights to this footage belongs to the broadcaster and the provider of that. So I'm hopeful and thankful that this footage will be allowed to be used for the informational purposes in which it's intended. We're going to start off with the first video footage of an inauguration speech, because obviously there have been presidents who came before the time of the inauguration, and there's perhaps some fantastic speeches that we will never know how they sounded like. Whether it's George Washington as the first president of the USA, whether it's Abraham Lincoln speaking on his first term on the eve of civil war in the US, or in his second term seeing the conclusion of civil war in the US. There's some fantastic speeches that we'll just never know what the speakers sound like, never know what the speeches sound like. We have to go to 1933 to find the first video footage of this. And this is FDR's first inauguration speech. Now, something that I'll also cover at this moment in time. In this series, I'm only going to look at the first inauguration speech of each president. So when they come back a second time, or in FDR cases, more than a second time, I'm not going to be looking at those speeches. I'm looking at their inauguration speech, because this is where they really set out their stall and set a stand for who they are going to be. They're looking at the context in which they're taken in the office, and they're saying what change they're going to be, or what building blocks they're going to put in on top of the person who came before. In 1933, the FDR was coming into a huge maelstrom. We had the Great Depression, which had been setting in for a number of years. In the United States, unemployment rates were at 20%, and people were clamoring out for something to be done about the situation. And FDR was coming in with a lot of ideas for social programs and social reforms, and a lot of that feeds into his speech. He talks about having to make tough decisions, but making those tough decisions with courage. He talks about having a plan, but recognizing that not everything will go to plan. So he's got to walk this tightrope between providing hope, but not making false promises. And we're going to see how he does this in this particular speech. So I'm going to cut into the footage and I'm going to pick out some clips and explain what he's doing, why it's working, the techniques that are involved. We're going to go through all of his good stuff that he's doing. And then after that, I'm going to pick out a few areas where I think even the great FDR could have made a couple improvements to make his speech even stronger. Let's go into the footage.
I will address them with a candor and a decision which the present situation of our people impels. This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
You see all of these words coming through right at the beginning of the speech about being honest, telling the whole truth, frankly, boldly. What FDR is doing here is he is showing that he recognizes the problem. He's not pretending that there isn't a problem, and he's not trying to get the audience to pretend there isn't a problem. If you want people to believe you have the solution, they have to believe that you understand the problem. And this is why at the beginning of the speech, FDR is drawing upon these types of words, synonyms of truth and honesty, essentially, to show, look, I know what the problem is. I'm not going to pretend there isn't a problem. I'm not going to mince my words, and I'm not going to try and pretend it's something that's not. I'm going to take it head on. I see there's a problem. I understand it. And with that foundation, he can then start to paint the journey from problem to solution. But it has to start with that forthrightness right at the beginning of the speech.
This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. So first of all,
you've got a classic rule of three there. The rule of three is one of the most commonly used speaking techniques. When we organize things into threes, it's the smallest number that an audience recognizes as a pattern. So we see three things, we go, there's a pattern. It draws our attention to it more. What's interesting about this rule of three is it paints a journey. So this nation will endure. So first of all, we are going to survive the current challenges. It will revive. Okay, so we're going to get back to the way things were. We're going to restore to normality, but also prosper. Well, prosper suggests that actually we're going to go in a direction that's better than what we had before. So this rule of three is painting a journey of how we're going to deal with the present, how we're going to revive some of the past, and how we're going to improve in the future. All of that implication of a journey contained in 3 words. That's the power of the rule of three. The rule of three helps you get across strong, direct information in a small period of time.
let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
And that, of course, is the iconic line from this inauguration speech. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And you'll notice the way that Franklin Delano Roosevelt, don't know why I went away from the initials there. Wasn't going to call him Franklin, but that felt a bit informal. So FDR here, he says, the only thing we have to fear, and then he pauses. And that pause gets the audience reflecting, thinking, well, what is it that we fear? Well, I fear that I'm not going to have a job next week. I fear that I'm not going to get paid. I fear that I'm not going to be able to keep a roof above my head. I fear that I'm not going to be able to provide for my family. I fear that I'm not going to be able to realize my dreams in life. These are all of the things that start going through people's heads when the fear is prompted. And in that pause, people reflect. And then FDR comes in. It's fear itself. All of those thoughts that come up when we talk about fear, that's what is actually needed to be to be feared, because that fear will keep us in the situation. It'll keep us in the problem. So he's addressing the problem head on with some of this frankness, honesty, a little message of endurance and resilience coming through. But also, we need to think differently in order to make things different. And that's what makes this such an iconic line. It really encapsulates the whole spirit of what he does throughout this entire speech, is saying, look, things are bad now. They can improve, but we need to change if that improvement is to come. So it's a fantastic line, and it's one of the reasons why it's the one that's always quoted. And if there is an unofficial title for this inauguration speech, it is that exact line. And that's why I've made it the title of this YouTube video.
They only know the rules of a generation of self-seekers. They have no vision. And when there is no vision, the people perish. Yes, the money changers have fled from their high seats in the temple of our civilization. We may now restore that temple to the ancient truth.
What's coming in here is suddenly there's a lot of higher, more noble language coming through. There's a lot of spiritual couching in some of this language. And this is where we're starting to see some of the shift in what FDR is talking about. That the start of this speech is very much about framing the problem. And now he's starting to move out of the problem and into the solution. And what he's speaking to here with this kind of very religious and spiritual terminology is pointing towards something better and something higher. And a lot of the principles of the United States government, people, nation is couched in that religious thinking. So using some of this terminology, talking about having a vision, talking about a temple, talking about civilization, all of that is pointing towards, here is the overarching thing that we're aiming for. Right now, we're in the struggles, but there is something that we can aim for, something that the very foundations of who we are and what this nation stands for is based on. And let's get back to that, because getting back to that is going to help us to rise above.
That confidence languishes, for it thrives only on honesty, on honor, on the sacredness of obligations.
We've got another rule of three: honesty, honor, sacredness. And these are very high virtues to be talking about. So we're continuing to build the aspiration in the speech. We had talks of the visions and the temples, talking about that spiritual religious language. And here we're getting that virtuous language coming in, talking about, well, what are the best aspects of us as humans? And what are those virtues and values that we reach for? Well, we aspire to be honest. We aspire to be noble. We aspire to be sacred even. So again, the rule of three, it brings an audience's attention in to whatever point you're making. So by rattling off those three virtues, FDR is pulling the audience's attention towards thinking about themselves in terms of virtues, thinking about themselves in terms of aspiration, starting to come out of that challenge and looking towards where are we wanting to go. And that's starting to address the individual. If we're going to get out of this situation, you've got to think about what you do as an individual, how you rise above, how you aim for those aspirations. And when the individuals are doing it, then bringing it together as the collective. And you'll hear some of that terminology come through a little bit later in the speech.
And finally, in our progress towards a resumption of work, we require two safeguards against a return of the evils of the old order. There must be a strict supervision of all banking and credits and investments.
Some things never change.
There must be an end to speculation with other people's money. And there must be provision for an adequate but sound currency.
We've got another rule of three there. And this repetition is slightly different. There must be, there must be, there must be. This technique is called anaphora. Now, don't worry about the technical terms too much. Anaphora is a phrase that's repeated at the start of a sentence or a point. There must be, there must be, there must be. The way that I remember this, anaphora at the start. A for at the start, A is anaphora. The opposite of anaphora is epistrophe. This is a sentence. This is this is the repetition of a phrase at the end of a sentence. Epistrophe at the end. So don't worry about the technical terms. If you remember them, great. All you've got to remember is repeating a phrase at the start or end of the sentence. And when you repeat a phrase at the start of a sentence, what you're doing is you're making a bold statement and you're drawing people's attention to this is what's going to happen. This is what's going to happen. The audience start paying attention more to what you say after a phrase that has been repeated. What FDR is doing here with his anaphora is he's moving into much more of a practical element of the speech. At the beginning of the speech, there was a lot of emotional connection there. I understand the problem, I understand the challenges you're facing. Then it rose up into almost a spiritual level. Well, not almost, it was a spiritual level of this is what we stand for, this is what we're all about, this is where we're aiming to go. And remember I said at the beginning, people want you to understand the problem. And when you do, then they believe you have the solution. Well, once they believe that you understand the problem, yeah, great. But then they want to hear the solution. Okay, you get the problem, but what are you going to do about it? And this is where the practical element is coming in. There's going to be this thing, and then we're going to do this thing, and then we're going to do this thing. So here FDR is moving into that place of authority and leadership and saying, this is what I'm going to do. This is how I'm going to help. And people won't follow and believe in that. If you just come out straight and say, I'm going to do this, there's that skepticalness and that defensiveness of, yeah, okay, right. You know, your words sound good, but is your money where your mouth is? But by starting off with that emotional connection and then having that kind of spiritual aspiration coming in, once he's onto the practical process and the practical steps, people go, okay, here is someone who knows what the situation is about. They've got a vision for where they want to go, and it looks like they've got a practical game plan for how we do it.
These measures, or such other measures, as the Congress may build out of its experience and wisdom, I shall seek within my constitutional authority to bring to speedy adoption. But
you've got three words there, almost a triad. There's a pair and a separate word. He talks about Congress's experience and wisdom, and he talks about his authority. What he's doing here is he's establishing a little bit of credibility. He said, okay, here are the practical things we're going to do. And when someone hears the practical steps, they go, okay, but do you have the power to do this? Do you have the ability to do this? And here he's showing, well, look, we've got a Congress of a lot of experience, a lot of wisdom. They're going to really help. I have a lot of authority in my office and in my position that's going to allow me to say, look, this is what we're doing. This is how we're doing it, drawing upon all those resources and channeling it with that leadership and that authority. So here we're getting some credibility established. Again, it's a rule of three, maybe not as traditional as a rule of three as we've seen elsewhere, but those are three really important words that come close together that tells the audience, look, I'm not just some joker standing up here. I'm someone who has the backing to be able to do what I say I'm going to do.
we face the arduous days that lie before us in the warm courage of national unity with the clear...
I love that line. If it wasn't for the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, I think that would be the soundbite from this speech. The warm courage of national unity. There's so much to like about that phrase. It's something that's uplifting. We're talking about warm, fuzzy, feel good. We've got some strength in there, courage, Courage is not about not feeling fear. Courage is about feeling the fear and doing it. It's having strength to do what you want to do, regardless of the fear that you're facing. And then you've got that national unity. You've got that collective idea. A little bit earlier in the speech, FDR was appealing a bit more towards the individual and saying these are the virtues that we're aiming for. We're aiming for honesty, we're aiming for honor, we're aiming for sacredness. That's speaking to like, what can you do? You know, as a later president will say, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. So yes, you need to speak to the individual, but for a large problem, you need a collective solution. And that is contained within this phrase. So there's so much to like about that. It's probably my favorite phrase in the speech, even more so than the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. It's a wonderfully written line. Definitely my favorite soundbite, the warm courage of national unity. If you're finding this analysis of FDR's speech helpful at the moment, then you maybe want to get your speeches analyzed in a similar way. And that's a service that I provide with my public speaking coaching. If you've got an important speech coming up, probably not an inauguration speech for President of the United States, but something that does have a lot of stakes in it. That may be the TEDx stage, you maybe have an industry conference coming up, an important workshop or keynote that you've got, and you want that extra help and support to really sharpen up and hone in on your speech, then we can work together in a speaking coaching format. To find out more information about how I can help you with speaking coaching, easiest way is just to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I've popped a link to my LinkedIn in the description below. Just send me a message on there. I'll talk you through a couple of the different speaking coaching options that we have so that you can get your speeches analyzed, honed in, and ultimately get your speech in the best possible place for when you've got to deliver it in that important scenario. Now what we're going to do is look at FDR's speech and what could be improved in his great speech, but there's never a perfect speech. Let's see what we can do for him. We've highlighted lots of good aspects of the inauguration speech. There are a couple areas where I think there could have been some improvements. Now these of course are just suggestions. They may not necessarily have made the speech better, might not necessarily have allowed the speech to reach people in a deeper way, to impact more, but no speech is ever perfect. So we can always think about what are the possibilities for how we might have made this speech better. I've got a couple of ideas that I'm going to share with you just now.
Happiness lies not in the mere possession of money. It lies in the joy of achievement, in the thrill of creative effort, the joy of the moral stimulation of work.
What we almost had there was another triad, another rule of three. So it talked about joy, talked about thrill, and then we went back to joy. And I wondered, I don't know for sure, I wonder if on the script there was a different word written, that third word, and FDR just misremembered or misread or misspoke. It felt like it was going to go joy, thrill, something else. It was almost as if he had joy stuck in his head. He went back to joy again. I would have liked to have seen a different word come in there to try and activate as many different subtleties and nuances of emotion in the audience. So all of these are largely synonyms for being happy, right? And FDR just talked about happiness in the sentences before. So you've got a feeling of joy, you've got a thrill. So thrill is maybe a little bit more of like an excitement and a rush. Joy is like a very high thing. I wonder if we could have had another word in there that was more of the kind of slow burn, maybe something like bliss, gratitude. That kind of word, I think, would have touched upon, essentially we're trying to activate happiness and positivity in the audience. And using different words will reach different people. All of them will activate that feeling of happiness, but they'll do it in their slightly different ways. So we had an opportunity for a rule of three that I think would have helped to generate more of an emotional connection, and maybe just a little bit of a missed opportunity there.
And there must be provision for an adequate but sound currency. These, my friends, are the lines of attack. I shall presently urge upon a new...
So I come back to this area, and we covered this in the positive section, talking about anaphora, there must be. And I won't play the whole following aspect after this. But when you go and watch this for full, at this point in the speech, I got a little bit, I'm going to use the word bored. And I think a better word than bored is a little bit uninspired. So we heard these phrases of there must be, and I did credit them for being action statements. What I think could have been added afterwards, I had a little question in my head of, so what? Okay, so we're going to regulate this. So what does that mean to me as an ordinary citizen? We're going to ensure the regulation of the currency. Okay, so what does that mean to me as a citizen? So these were all quite highfalutin statements, and the irony, of course, is they are still things we talk about needing nowadays. How does my life look different when we do those things? So I think there just needed to be a little bit more of a connection of, here's what I'm going to do. So the action and the direction was strong. I wanted to have the trickle down of, here's what I'm going to do, and that's how it's going to help you. Here's what I'm going to do, that's how it helps you. There's a little mnemonic for you to remember for your speeches. When you are telling the audience, this is what I'm going to do, you've got to have that follow through of, this is what it means for you.
We do not distrust the future of essential democracy. The people of the United States have not failed. In their need, they have registered a mandate that they want direct, vigorous action. They have...
So I find this part of the speech a little bit strange. I think it's probably a bit emblematic of the times. Remember, this is 100 years ago, and people spoke differently, and people kind of address certain topics differently. And I find this part of the speech quite impersonal. The people of the United States, it's as if he's speaking about another country. It's like saying, oh, the people of Germany are doing this, the people of Japan are doing this. The people of the United States, that's who you have in front of you. And it's talking about, they have decided in their knowledge. It's, why are we talking about these people as if they're not here? They're here in front of you. So I do think that's maybe a little bit of an old-fashioned way of speaking. So I think it is partly of the times. What I would be looking for here is, like, this is where you get that collective buy-in. Now, he did use the word we just before then, and that I think is a good collective buy-in. But let's hear some you. Let's make this more personal. You, the people, have decided in your wisdom that you want this to change. So addressing the audience who are there in front of you, rather than talking about them in this kind of third person as if they're not there, I find this part of the speech a little bit strange. And that's something that I think you wouldn't hear that line nowadays, because people speak differently and people approach this kind of topic differently. They're willing to be a little bit more direct and a little bit personal. So I don't want to critique someone too much in terms of a 21st century perspective on a 20th century person and audience. But if we were to do the speech in the future and we were to try and embody some of the good principles of this speech and think about what are some of the things we improve on, that is one thing that I would be looking for. This is coming right at the end of the speech. You can see the timestamp. FDR is wrapping up here. And overall, I think the structure of this speech is good. He addresses the problem head on. He addresses it with honestness, frankness. We're not dodging the problem. We're not pretending it's smaller than it is. We're acknowledging it's real. Okay, here's the problem. What are we aiming for? Here are our aspirations. Here's the vision of what we're going to do. Great. Now, this isn't just an empty, hopeful vision. Here are some practical steps of how we do this. This is what I'm going to do. This is the help that I'm going to get. This is going to be a collective effort to help you as the people. And this is how your experience is going to change as a result. This is the very first televised inauguration speech. It's still held up as one of the iconic inauguration speeches. So certainly, even though I've nitpicked a couple of things there, that's not to say that this speech didn't work and it failed. It was a very successful speech. And ultimately, FDR got re-elected 3 times. 3 times. He won 4 elections back when you could still run in 4 elections. Things have changed now. And as we'll see in the future presidents we're going to cover, at best they only got 8 years, and sometimes they only got 4 years, and sometimes they got even less than that. There's certainly some famous inauguration speeches that we'll see who had less than 4 years to act that out. So that's our first inauguration speech in the series covered. We're going to be going through and covering all of the presidents up until all of the presidents up until the present day. As I stated at the beginning of this video, we are just doing their first inauguration speech, i.e. their inaugural inauguration speech. There's still about a dozen or so of those to go through. So these are going to be coming out roughly every month or so. I need to get all of them out before the election date in November of 2024. So we'll be covering all the presidents up until then. And yes, we will be covering presidents from both parties as well. So don't think there's going to be any political bias in here. We're going to be looking at the speeches purely in terms of their speaking ability. We are going to talk about some of the political styles and political contexts around that, but I'm not going to be favoring one party over the other and saying these presidents from this party are better than those presidents of those parties. There are things that we can learn about speaking from all aspects and all sides of the political spectrum. And you'll see these coming up in the inauguration videos to come. The only thing that you have to fear is missing one of these videos.